we're going to focus on just a couple of common challenges, 3 or 4. And what we see there are principally distinguishing how to fund and what role preparedness and mitigation activities play in the rebuilding process. Using the urgent need national objective. Obviously, you're rebuilding from a disaster. It's urgent. Isn't everything urgent, of course, but when and how to use use your low mod income national objective primarily everywhere it's available, and then how to use the national objective for urgent need. Some issues that come up with leveraging these dollars with other funds, and then issues of using these funds in places that have received numerous disaster impacts, perhaps multiple impacts in a single year, or year after year, where you have received funding for the disaster impacts in one year but not another. So just to move forward, to address preparedness and mitigation activities, what we always want to make clear is that HUD encourages you to incorporate mitigation and preparedness into your rebuilding activities. We want you to, as you're rebuilding, we want you to reduce risk and reduce the cost of the impacts of future disasters. We want you to rebuild safer, rebuild stronger, more energy efficient, and everything else. And we acknowledge there are, greater costs to rebuilding in that manner, but there's overall demonstrated a cost savings over time in mitigating properties that are at high risk. But with that said, it's very common after a disaster for communities and individuals to obviously begin thinking about preparing for the next disaster. And so obviously everybody would like a generator. We'd like to outfit the entire built landscape with a generator so that everybody's prepared. We'd like an emergency shelter in every neighborhood. Those are kind of ideal conditions that that are unattainable but desirable nonetheless. And so what we have to acknowledge is that the money that we receive and that you receive is limited. It's not enough to meet just all of your rebuilding needs, let alone all of your preparedness and mitigation needs. Rebuilding needs meaning all of your recovery and rebuilding needs to recover and rebuild from the effects of the previous disaster. And so then in all of those activities, you should be looking into and incorporating mitigation and preparedness into all of those activities. But then there are other proposals and projects where folks will just want to fund just what is simply a standalone preparedness activity, such as a generator where outfitting generators everywhere, where it's not a part of the recovery and rebuilding process. So most kind of a simple example would be, if there's a hospital and maybe it had a generator, maybe it didn't. If it did, it was in the basement. Let's say it flooded, so they're rebuilding the hospital. So you'll purchase a new generator. It might need to be larger. It might need to be placed on the roof instead of in the basement, or it might need a standalone elevated platform or something. All those costs are eligible. You certainly want to put a emergency power source back into the facility that was damaged when you're rebuilding it, if it failed or whatever. But you can't use the funds are not intended to be used to put generators on every public facility that doesn't have one, kind of at the expense of rebuilding homes. And the priority is getting things rebuilt first before you start spending money for preparedness in terms of future disasters. So it's a little bit nuanced. It's not always clear, but if you just try to focus on making a very clear connection, is this mitigation activity and or preparedness activity, is it part of the rebuilding process? If it is, then it should be eligible and incorporate it. If it's kind of a standalone and it seems to exclusively apply to, reducing risk or preparing for a future disaster and doesn't necessarily have a connection to the impacts of the last disaster, then you need to really take a close look at that to determine if it would truly be eligible for these types of funds. Those activities may be eligible with normal CDBG funding, but just not disaster recovery CDBG, because these funds need to recover from the disaster for which they were appropriated. So standard, the goal is to rebuild safer and stronger, and some of these standard examples of eligible activities are buyouts, floodplain mapping. When you're rebuilding, elevating the home, floodproofing, outfitting a house with roof straps, storm shutters, using stronger materials, all of that stuff. If you're in a tornado-stricken area and you're rebuilding the public facility and it needs a siren, go ahead and incorporate that preparedness measure into the facility that's being rebuilt if that's an appropriate measure. But use your best judgment. Tanil, you want to go over urgent need?
One of the things that we discussed actually on a conference call recently with our 2011 grantees is the use of the urgent need national objective. Many of you who currently have CDBG regular program funds, this may not be a national objective you use, if ever. But in disaster recovery, it is probably the most common national objective, of course, next to meeting or benefiting low and moderate income households. The urgent need national objective, if you're familiar with the state guide to CDBG national objectives and eligible activities, or the entitlements guide, it actually gives a disaster example. Repairing places that were damaged by a tornado, using CDBG funds to meet an urgent health and safety need that you don't currently have funds for, and there is no other source. Well, there is some carryover, of course, into the disaster recovery context. One of the things that we didn't change, though, is that activities that you qualify under or classify under the national objective of urgent need should address a serious and immediate threat to community health and welfare. Where there is a nuance for disaster recovery relates to simply your ability to address that need. So right after the disaster, everything feels urgent. All the things that happen in a span of time that you're trying to immediately address. In recognition, though, of the long-term recovery effort, we know that grantees cannot address them all on day 0, let alone on day 20, day 90, or day 180. One of the things then that we emphasize with grantees is that you should be very clear about what your needs are in your action plan, preferably in the initial, but as you're discovering those needs. If you identify those needs within the first 18 months of the disaster, that's what we're going to consider in terms of activities that you can classify under the urgent need national objective. That's a particular nuance that we don't normally have, of course, with the regular CDBG program, but it's one worthy of noting here. And it seems almost counterintuitive, but our experience is you just can't address every need the day it happens or 30 days out. And so we've made that particular interpretation for disaster recovery. You want to speak to leveraging now?
Sure. And again, to Tino's point, with the 18-month window, if you have to rebuild thousands of homes, you can't do it in 18 months. But that doesn't mean that on the 19th month after the disaster, it's any less urgent. It's still urgent. It's still the same need that existed. So that's why it's still considered an urgent need. For leveraging disaster recovery funds, obviously we see this greatest with, like we said earlier, FEMA funds, FEMA PA and HMGP funds, but also with United States Corps of Engineer levy projects, And one of the things that they often have one is there is a if you're using funds to supplement or leverage a core levy project, contact your CPD rep, and then so we can talk about that on a project by project basis with us. There are some kind of specific thresholds in which project amounts that leveraging is able to be done for. We can get there. We just need to work with you on a one-on-one basis. But the other challenge with the Corps of Engineers is that they sometimes need the money up front. And obviously, we work on a kind of a reimbursement basis. But if your grantee is required to finance the project up front in a lump sum, and that's a statutory requirement of the core levy project funding, then that may be available or may be able to be funded in that way. Again, it's not to be used to supplant core funding, but to supplement it. It's not to replace it. And Corps of Engineers is there are kind of some unique terms there. There are every year Congress authorizes the Corps of Engineers to build. They're authorized to build an incredible amount of public works, but they're only budgeted or appropriated to kind of really build a small portion of what they're actually authorized to do. The authorization is a much longer term kind of strategic authorization that Congress provides. So just because a project is authorized doesn't mean that it's necessarily funded. So but if funds have been budgeted or appropriated by Congress for a levy project, then whatever portion of funding for that project, CDBG funds can't, those would be duplicative. CDBG funds can't be used to replace those. If there's a non-federal match, they can go on top of that, but that's what you need to do is first identify if core funds have been budgeted for that project. Talking about the lump sum requirement that you sometimes find, and then you'll need a kind of a letter or something from the Corps, indicating that that there is an actual need for the funds. For FEMA, you can you can use the funds for non-federal match for public assistance projects as well as hazard mitigation projects. But that doesn't mean just because it's a FEMA, PA, or HMGP project, you can use it as federal match. It still has to be a CDBG eligible activity, or eligible under the a waiver or alternative requirement or something in the notices. To the extent that those projects are also eligible for CDBG funding, you can use our funds as match for those projects. And then any other program that may require a non-federal match or cost share.
One thing to note as I pull up the slide on subsequent disasters in your current funding or even previous disasters, in using the urgent need national objectives, one of the waiver requests that we often get is related to serving low and moderate income populations. And one thing that we remind grantees of is that, one, of course, disasters hit everyone. They hit your low mod population, they hit the folks who are above moderate income. Well, how do you serve them? One, because you're not traditionally serving them in your standard CDBG program, so they're not even a clientele that you're used to working with. One of the national objectives that you'll end up using to serve them for eligible activities is the urgent need national objective. And what this often looks like on the technical side in DRGR is you have, say, for example, a single family rehab activity. You'll have one single family rehab activity and you may put a little code on there that says low mod. Same rules, but that's who the program serves. Same activity, you'll note low single-family housing rehab, and next to that, you'll put a code that notes urgent need, so that you can distinguish and easily track where your funds are going to serve those two populations, especially, again, given that you still have an overall benefit requirement for the program, but you're interested also in looking to see how you can meet the needs of your above moderate income population. So here's a question, and it's actually the last of the series that we often get, which is a scenario that some of you are in the middle of right now. You have an allocation that you received for specific disasters with a disaster number that was assigned by FEMA. But you were hit by another disaster that wasn't specifically named in the appropriation that Congress set forth to HUD to award to you. And so the question becomes, hey, why can we use this money to help the folks who were damaged by disaster number 2? And in short, the answer generally is no. And here's the context that I'll give you before I talk about what the window is. Congress is very specific in those appropriations. They've either named the specific disaster, Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, or they've named the time frames of the disaster. 2011 disasters, disasters in 2010 for these specific areas. HUD then takes that charge from Congress and publishes in the Federal Register notice with the specifics of your allocation, the very specific disaster number so you know where to apply it. Those are there for a reason. Those are the funds, those are the disasters that the funds are targeted to. But there is one exception, and there's an acknowledgement of timing here, and that's what's pointed out in this slide. There are the circumstances where you just got your funding, where you're pushing your funding out the door, you're working on those homes, you're assisting those businesses, and right before you could get to them all, the next tornado comes, the next flood comes. If the damages, if the impacts of the original disaster, the ones you got the funding for, are exacerbated by disaster number 2, and those losses from the original disaster are otherwise met, then our example shows that you can use those funds in this manner. And I want to pay particular attention to the example. Let's say the public facility was damaged in 2008, and you haven't had a chance to repair it. It's one of the things that you have identified. You've identified public facilities in your plan, but you haven't had an opportunity to get to it yet. You've queued it up. And then you're hit with a second disaster. The additional CDBG disaster, or I should say CDBG disaster recovery funds may be used to fully complete the repairs for the disaster or for that public facility and address the need as it currently exists. Now let's give the opposite example. Public facility was hit by the 2008 disaster. You have repaired it with your 2008 funds. It's done. You had the ribbon cutting. It's in the newspaper. Everyone's hugs and kisses. It gets hit by a disaster again that you didn't get an appropriation for. You can't come back and assist it again with those funds. You didn't get the allocation for that amount. With me so far? All right. So let's note then what they can be used, and this gets back to the tieback. CDBG disaster recovery funds may not be used for activities that address a need solely arising from a disaster which funds were not appropriated, nor can they be used to address a need that has been met already. That was the latter example I gave of trying to assist that same public facility. And the example again gives that illustration. This question comes up often, and it's one to note, and I caution you on making promises not only to your citizens, but particularly your elected officials about what you can do with your existing disaster recovery funds. And if there's any confusion on this point, please contact your CPD field office or HUD headquarters. But remember, you have in your hand the actual Federal Register notice that tells you for what purpose you can use those funds, but also for which disasters. The reason why we've chosen these to highlight in our presentation, not only because of their most common questions, and in the current context, unfortunately, disasters are happening seemingly right after another, but these are the questions, quite frankly, that you may get from our federal partners, FEMA, SBA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They're posing these questions to you, and so you can take this information with you and use it to respond to them. Before we head to our closing remarks, are there any questions on those or final comments? Question in the rear?
All 48 counties.
Again, actually, that's a good segue into the something I'd like to address now. Jennifer, are you able to pull that document up? Some of you may have grabbed the FAQ doc, the frequently asked questions doc, for the 2011 disasters that's been out at the registration table, and I just kind of wanted to walk through that with you for the 2011 grantees here and the respective HUD CPD folks. I'm sorry, 2 or 3. So the overall appropriation is $400 million, and this is a table that identifies each grantee and its overall allocation on the left. The language of the appropriation said that it's for the most impacted and distressed areas resulting from the impacts of disasters in 2011, the calendar year 2011. So HUD, that kind of congressional mandate to dedicate the funds to the most impacted and distressed areas, how we've addressed that is by identifying the states and the counties within those states with the greatest estimated unmet needs. So FEMA looks at SBA data and FEMA data and other things and arrives at what portion of the need, an estimate of what portion of need won't be met by other resources like the FEMA grants and SBA loans and insurance and other things. And so in order to ensure that the funds actually get targeted to the most impacted and distressed areas, there's been an 80% rule that's kind of been applied. And what it is that so some of in each state, counties with more than $10 million in estimated unmet needs are identified as the most impacted, and that's where the state is able to spend their funds, states that are receiving grant funds here. So, for example, New York is able to spend their funds, their $71 million, in 5 counties. However, two places within those 5 counties received direct allocations. So what the 80% rule is that 80% of the total of all funding awarded within the state, so the sum total of the state's 71, Orange County's 11, and the town of Union's 10, the sum total of that, 80% of that figure is $53 million. So the state of New York has to spend a minimum of $53 million within those 5 counties. Obviously, county of Orange County will all the local grantees that receive direct allocations, they're going to be spending 100% of all of their funds within their jurisdiction. Sometimes the counties, these are actual urban counties, so maybe not all communities, urban counties under the traditional core CDBG program, and so not all communities or areas within the geographic bounds of that county may be participating as a urban county, and so the state's funds can be used to meet that gap for any portions of a county that are not a part of the urban county jurisdiction. the county has when it serves as an entitlement. In terms of, I think your question, that still doesn't answer your question. It is also in the FAQ document. What needs to happen is it's for all major disasters declared in 2011. So if there are 4 disasters in a total of 48 counties, then yes, that's the total of all of the declared counties. Then the counties, some will have received a declaration for individual assistance, or IA, and some for, so it has to have received a declaration for housing assistance, which is IA for FEMA, or public assistance for categories of work C through G, which is permanent rebuilding of public infrastructure. Sometimes FEMA makes declarations just for debris removal, or kind of temporary interim measures. Those counties wouldn't be eligible. So we're looking at counties with significant impacts, those with a housing declaration or a permanent infrastructure rebuilding declaration, one or the other or both. A lot of them will normally have both, the real severely impacted ones. And that will kind of limit the universe down from maybe 48 to the most impacted. And then, of course, for New York, you would have to spend the $53 million, your 80%, within those 5, and then you've got the remainder you've got the other 20% to flexibly use throughout the rest of your impacted counties as you see most appropriate. Clear as mud, right? And any questions? I mean, we can obviously continue to chat one-on-one afterward regarding your particular jurisdiction and how this may or not apply. But we've tried to make it as simple as we could, but it's still a bit complicated. Question in the back there, yeah.
Hi, I'm from Orange County, so now I'm a little confused. So just to clarify what you said, our funds can only be used in our urban county consortium member areas.
Correct.
So we have 37 municipalities.
Right.
The rest of them, mainly the 3 cities, then would be covered by the state allocation.
Correct. So you're still operating just like you normally would. You're serving the same service area as you would as a normal entitlement jurisdiction, an urban county jurisdiction.
Okay. Okay.
My Union Township is here, and there's a potential project that's, I'm not sure how you're looking at this, if it's site-specific or in terms of the damage. There's a joint facility between the Endicott Johnson City and the city of Binghamton. Now, the city of Binghamton obviously is not in that allocation for the town of Union, but the Johnson City is. So can we assist the sewer plant that's a joint project between Johnson City and Binghamton, or how is that determined?
So that's something that we'll talk about offline. Those are, we understand there may and probably will be scenarios like that where projects do straddle lines of jurisdictions. And so we'll have to, I think, what we'll do is consider, sometimes you might be most appropriate to consider which jurisdiction the majority of that project physically resides in, or it may be most appropriate to look at the service population, the service area for which it provides services to. But we can talk about the site-specific project and arrive at a what would be the most appropriate place for that project to reside under. But there are and probably will be circumstances when it's not exactly crystal clear because of shared jurisdictions. I thought there was a question over here. Ms. Heather?
Can you repeat our question?
Yeah, the question was, how did HUD decide to go with a state versus a local direct grant? It's not really versus, it's in addition to. So where we are able to identify cities and counties with that threshold of $10 million in unmet needs, estimated unmet needs, and we're able to make an allocation directly to that, and that community has hopefully what we believe is, you know, adequate capacity to administer it directly, then the department makes a direct allocation to the local government so that they're able to administer it directly. Then the balance of the funds remaining out for the impacts outside of that jurisdiction throughout the rest of the state, that goes to the state to meet the needs of the balance. Carrie, Stan, we hit that about as accurately as we can. Yeah, so, you know, there are, I mean, we do carefully consider this, and especially, you know, it had been over a decade since we had made large grants directly to units of local government, and Congress decided to reinsert that language beginning in 2010, which allowed us to make grants to 5 entitlement communities that year in Rhode Island and Tennessee, and then another 9 for the 2011 disasters. But we, in identifying who will receive a direct grant, conducting a risk analysis is a standard component of our evaluation. We look at you know, the history of your performance. Have you handled CDBG funds before? In what amount? Are there outstanding findings? Are there other, you know, issues? And then, you know, have there been corrective actions taken to address, if there have been deficiencies that have been identified? Have corrective actions been adequately, you know, undertaken and implemented? And so, you know, there is a risk analysis process that's conducted, and, you know, if you know, at the end of the day, if the capacity doesn't exist or the risk is too great, then the option is still for the funds still to get to that place, but simply be granted through the state, who has you know, a greater capacity and capability.